We live in the most technologically connected culture ever. And as a result of our phones and tablets, computers, and other devices, we can connect with anyone, anytime, anywhere in the world. And yet polls and studies show that loneliness is more pervasive than at any other time in human history. Loneliness is one of the greatest struggles of our time. Just think about most TV commercials. They're not really about the products that they're selling. They're about fellowship, friendship, relationship, suggesting that their products can provide or enhance those things. They show people having a great time together because advertisers know how deeply the human heart hungers for those connections. But with so much noise and imagery and ads and notifications, it's easy for our attention to be consumed by everything except the people around us. And even though there's this growing sense that it's a growing problem, and everyone experiences it from time to time, it feels vulnerable to actually say, "I'm lonely." We're embarrassed that we're lonely, and we don't even want people to know about it. The dictionary defines loneliness as being without company. But that seems like an inadequate definition, doesn't it? Because the feeling of loneliness isn't confined to the physical state of being alone. You can experience intense loneliness even in a huge crowd. And worse still is to have friends or family not understand you or your point of view. To feel alone in your opinions and your thoughts, your feelings, your concerns, your sorrow and your sadness. Or worse of all, perhaps is to have some really good news of great joy and the people around you be unimpressed or uninterested. I experience this all the time with my youth minister, Nick. He's a great guy. He is indispensable, really, to me. But he's not what you would call a very expressive guy. He's muted. I'm Portuguese, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but he is definitely muted. Like just the other day, I've got this great news that I just have to share with him. So I march down the halls to his office. I'm bursting in to tell him this good news that I know he will be excited about. I stride right in there. I look him square in the eye, and ta-da, my news. And I get nothing. I get absolutely nothing in return. No expression whatsoever. And then he has the audacity to look me in the eye and say, "Wait, what?" It's like I said nothing at all. Devastating. So really, you can be in a successful business partnership, a close friendship, even a loving marriage, and still feel alone sometimes. You can be in charge of many employees and have lots of people working for you and reporting to you. You can be famous with lots of people dying to meet you and get your autograph and talk with you and still feel alone sometimes. On the other hand, sometimes getting away from people can be the best feeling there is. You can experience incredible relief when you get into that car and drive away after being in meetings all day. When guests who have overstayed their welcome finally say their goodbyes and you can actually close the door behind them. Or when your kids finally fall asleep and you can relax in your peace and quiet. Your level of comfort and solitude, and mine, will be different. And it depends on our personalities, of course. Some people are introverts, and some people, like me, are extroverts. But everyone at times enjoys being alone. So it's not just necessarily about being alone. Loneliness is much more complex. Loneliness is much more than simply being without company. It's an experience of isolation and alienation that is not chosen. It feels imposed. And that experience is painful. And we will often try anything and everything to ease the pain or just to avoid it altogether, often through many behaviors that are utterly self-defeating. Some people turn to busyness. They frantically run through life. Why are they so busy? Well, the answer is simple. Because they want to be. Artificial busyness makes them feel important and hide their loneliness from everybody else. Some people hold on to a relationship with the wrong person. They are codependent. They stay with someone they know is not good for them because they don't want to be alone. Others turn to stuff, thinking that the right clothes or the right car or the right kitchen will fill their loneliness. To escape loneliness, people self-medicate. They abuse alcohol or prescription drugs. Or they rely on binge eating and junk food and gambling and pornography. Or far worse, it can lead to anger and rage, despair, and the ultimate price, suicide. It can happen all the time, or any time, but we are especially susceptible to it in times of transition. You change jobs or schools, you lose a friend or a family member, going to college or sending your kid off to university, when the holidays or the vacation is over. These times can be strange experiences in which the feeling of loneliness descends on us and can actually consume us. Loneliness is a feeling. It's only a feeling, however acutely we feel it. It's only a feeling. But we cannot let feelings rule the major parts of our lives. And yet it's incredibly helpful to name and know our feelings, and terribly important to try and understand them. We've already talked about some of the dangers that can come from trying to sweep them under the rug. Everything from sticking around in a harmful relationship to addictions to grimly even death. And so that understanding of loneliness is a big part of what this series is all about. While we experience loneliness differently today, it isn't a new phenomenon, not at all. It's almost as old as human history. The original cause of loneliness was sin. Original sin. See, when God created the world, God anticipated this feeling. That's why he said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." It says that right in the beginning of the Bible in Genesis. Loneliness was not a part of the experience that God had designed for us. But then sin entered the world. Our first parents decided to disobey the only law that God had given them. They put themselves at the center of things instead of holding God there. In Scripture, we can see very clearly that their sin in turn leads to alienation. Sin leads to a threefold alienation. The first tier of our loneliness is our alienation from others. So most obviously, we experience loneliness when we are alienated or separated from others against our wishes, either physically or emotionally. And this is Adam and Eve, right? They sin, and what's the very first consequence of their sin? They experience marriage problems. The second tier of our loneliness is our alienation from ourselves. As a result of sin, we are no longer comfortable in our own skin. Again, this is Adam and Eve, right? They sin, and they quickly discover that they're naked. And this fills them with great shame. They are no longer comfortable in their own skin. The third tier of our loneliness is our alienation from God. And again, this is Adam and Eve as well. They sin, and then they run away and try to hide from God. Of course, God is always present with us, But that doesn't mean that we always feel his presence. It confuses us. Sin obscures his presence, like a cloud might block the sun. It doesn't mean that the sun's not there. It just might mean that you might not be able to see it or feel its warmth. Our loneliness is a reminder of our human condition that we have to work on to restore relationships. Ultimately, Jesus Christ came to help us out and to make all of this happen, offering healing and wholeness by restoring and reestablishing our relationship with God, thereby making possible right relationships among ourselves and indeed within ourselves. And he established his church to continue this work throughout history. Perhaps that's why, when he was painting a vision for the earliest of Christians, he challenged them, first of all, to reconsider their relationships. We are in the Gospel of St. Matthew. We're in the 5th chapter today. This passage is taken from the Sermon on the Mount. It was here that Jesus delivered his core message, outlining how he wants his followers to approach life and relationships. He begins by establishing their identity. They are to live out his teaching from this understanding of who they are as God sees them. And so he tells them, you are the salt of the earth. You are salt. Now, salt in the ancient world was a very valuable commodity. We get our English word salary from salt because soldiers and others were oftentimes paid in salt. It served as a preservative, of course, but more importantly, it was flavoring for food. This is more significant than at first it sounds. Jesus tells his audience, who for the most part lacked any kind of political or social influence, who lacked most material resources, people who were fairly impoverished, people who lived in obscurity and in backwater communities. He tells these people, improbably, that they are salt. If his followers had been asking the question, who are we? The obvious answer is, you're nobodies. Right? You're overtaxed and you're overwhelmed by the Roman occupiers, as well as your own intolerant and oppressive religious leaders. Everybody abuses you, and nobody cares about you. No one is paying attention to you. No one is listening. You have no influence, no voice, no rights. You own no property. You have no resources, and you've got no wealth. And yet, it was precisely many of these early followers, these first disciples, who would go on to turn the world upside down with the message of the gospel. Just like salt changes the flavor of food, his followers changed the world. He tells his disciples, you are like salt. And then he goes on to say, you are the light of the world. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before human beings, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Lights are put in strategic places to illuminate interiors. And in the same way, he is suggesting that his disciples will be like that. God wants his friends and followers to be salt, providing flavor for the world around them. He wants us to be light, strategically illuminating our community with the grace and truth of the gospel wherever we are and in whatever environment we find ourselves in, whether it be at work or at school or at the hockey rink or in our small groups. Your Christian faith is not a private possession. It is not a private possession to be held in isolation from the people around you. It should be illuminating and flavoring your relationships. And while we often think our environments are somewhat accidental or random, they never are. God has placed us exactly where He wants us to be right now, to be salt and light right there. In the next few weeks to come, we're going to look at steps that we can take to bring about that harmony that eliminates loneliness and equips us to fulfill the vision and the purpose that God has in mind for us. Being salt and light is about restoring right relationships with ourselves, with others, and with God. And ultimately, living in those restored relationships is the way to overcome loneliness.